Buy-in influence. Chinese investment in El Salvador. Our project today will be investigating the topic of China's increasing investments in the Latin America region through a case study in El Salvador. Over the past 18 years, Latin America has experienced an influx of Chinese investments, dramatically augmenting their political power within the region. Notably, much of this trade has been driven by China's state-operated banks, funneling more than $141 billion in loan commitments to the region. That is significantly more than the Western power-dominated World Bank within the same period. As can be seen in the graphic in the lower right, this increase in investment has corresponded with a resulting trade dominance in much of Latin America. As of 2023, China is now the largest trading partner of Latin America on average when excluding Mexico, and also the dominant trading partner of the Southern Cone plus Panama. Even more interesting is the simultaneous diplomatic shifts across Central America and the Caribbean when it comes to the issue of Taiwan, with 5 countries across the region dropping Taiwanese recognition within the past 8 years. Considering the political nature of Chinese state capital, such as an outsized inflow of Latin American investments, warrants an investigation into the attachment of an ulterior Chinese state agenda within the region. Literature on Chinese investments abroad contextualizes the Latin American case as an extension of President Xi Jinping's 2013 announcement of the Belt and Road Initiative. In a state speech, President Xi committed China to an era of enhanced global connectivity through a process of intensive global infrastructure investments directed in the spirit of recreating the ancient Silk Road. Experts on Chinese affairs have referred to and argued for the Belt and Road Initiative to be seen as one of the main instruments of China's grand strategy to not only reunify the Chinese state, but also regain its position as an uncontested dominant world economic power. As expected with strategic ploys to advance in the global stage, China has been subject to extensive criticism for the models in which they have gone about pursuing this investment-led strategy. That is, critics argue that China is preying on the developing world by issuing aggressive, high-dollar loans to countries that do not possess the financial projections to repay them. In cases such as the Chinese-funded Hambantota port in Sri Lanka, critical infrastructure and resources are put up as collateral by local governments to be ceded to the Chinese government should loan recipient countries default on their contracts. The United States, under the past 2 presidential administrations, has accused China of using loans to entice borrowing countries into a debt trap that gives Beijing sway over strategic assets and natural resources when governments can't repay. This debt trap diplomacy, as has been termed in academic circles, is a rather aggressive manifestation of China's economic diplomacy. Largely, China's economic diplomatic efforts look more akin to the economic levers typically exercised in global politics. Experts on the matter discussed at a panel hosted by the Brookings Institution how in setting its global connectivity agenda with an estimated $1 trillion commitment to foreign direct investments in primarily developing countries, Beijing seeks to carve out a leadership position within the global economy. Lastly, it is important to note that Chinese investment across the region is largely focused on commodities extraction, with commodities accounting for 75% of exports to China. Trincunas, a researcher on Sino-LA relations, argues that while this places the region in a vulnerable position with regard to trade, it does also place pressure on Chinese state managers to develop political synergy with Latin American leaders as a means to protect their long-term strategic needs for commodities. In addition, while the bulk of literature chooses to characterize the influx of Chinese investments in Latin America as yet another regional extension of China's diplomatic efforts in seeking new markets and expanding their economy, we argue that the dominant effect with these investments are towards generating political favor from Latin American nations in international forums.
The case of El Salvador is significant because it serves as a microcosm of China's growing influence in Latin America. In 2018, El Salvador severed ties with Taiwan and established formal relations with China. The Salvadoran government has increasingly distanced itself from the U.S. on governance and human rights issues. Studying this case can illuminate the consequences of Chinese investments in Latin America. These consequences may be economic, as investments may not lead to the benefit of El Salvador, but be extractive and lead to debt traps, economic dependence on China, and there also may be political implications of Latin America's reduced reliance on Western allies, as China's non-interference and neutrality may facilitate authoritarianism. This would reduce the pressure for transparency, press freedoms, and human rights protections. Finally, there is a potential for changes in the global balance of power. If these investments are successful, other countries may follow suit, and they may have the potential to reshape the global balance of power and Western influence.
Using El Salvador as a case study for the Latin American region, specifically the Central American subregion, Chinese investments in Latin America, 1. Directly weaken Taiwanese de jure statehood, 2. Undermine Western financing dominance and development goals, and 3. Siphon away American favor in international forums.
For this project, we employ a mixed methods approach to analyze the impact of Chinese investments in El Salvador. For the quantitative analysis, we analyze bilateral trade figures from the Observatory of Economic Complexity to track changes in exports, imports, and trade imbalances. We assessed El Salvador's debt profile through Bloomberg and compare El Salvador's voting record at the UN before and after the diplomatic switch to China. And for the qualitative analysis piece, we analyze news articles, public speeches, and policy announcements for rhetoric, and assess official investment agreements and media reports.
Costa Rica is a prime example of this mechanism and arguably set the precedent for the other Central American nations to follow suit. In June of 2007, Costa Rica announced its plan to sever ties with Taiwan in a quest to solicit Chinese investments domestically. This move was made on the assumption that China would financially reward Costa Rica for its promotion of the One China policy, as there was no official agreement prior. This risky assumption proved fruitful, as immediately after, within the same month, China announced $130 million in unrestricted grant aid to the small Costa Rican nation, with promises for further development collaboration. A decade after this event, we see a string of similar events across Central America and the Caribbean. In 2017 with Panama, 2018 with both the Dominican Republic and El Salvador, 2021 with Nicaragua, and 2023 with Honduras. Each of these nations has seen a subsequent large uptick in Chinese unrestricted grant aid, and is what I argue to be a hanging incentive for the remaining Latin American nations like Belize and Guatemala to drop Taiwanese diplomatic relations, furthering China's One China policy to eliminate international recognition of Taiwan. Another mechanism I want to focus on is the incentive for Latin American leaders to leverage the Chinese money pot, so to speak, as a domestic political tool sustaining party power. Not only does Taiwan's capacity to supply aid pale in comparison to China's, but so do the terms they are able to provide. Taiwan, like most nations, refuses loan agreements if a project is deemed economically infeasible. This is not the case with Chinese investments, as they have often been characterized as having a no questions asked status quo in regards to project aid provided to developing nations. This aid approach permits the perception of Chinese aid as a viable political tool within these countries. El Salvador is a perfect example of this. In practice, as Salvadorian president at the time, Sanchez Cerén, only switched diplomatic relations to China in the months following a Taiwanese refusal to issue aid to a Salvadoran port deemed economically infeasible, and that would have largely served to benefit an area known for being a bastion of Sanchez Cerén's party support. While China has yet to build said port, their establishment of special economic zones across about 14% of the country have largely been placed over areas that served as Sanchez Cerén's political base. The top image on the slide to the right maps Sanchez Cerén's base of support in red, where, as can be seen in the image just below, is the landscape for China's special economic zones within El Salvador. In a region known for its clientelistic quid pro quo politics, it can be argued that Chinese investments in Latin America have an especially pronounced effect on the last holdouts for countries still maintaining Taiwanese recognition.
Chinese investment in Latin America undermines Western financing by deepening dependence on China. Since the early 2000s, China and El Salvador's trade patterns have shifted. Based on data from the Observatory of Economic Complexity, El Salvador was becoming more dependent on China for critical infrastructure, even before officially joining the Belt and Road Initiative in 2018. Before 2009, El Salvador's main import from China was textiles, but since then, imports have shifted towards high-tech goods, such as broadcasting equipment and computers. This signals a shift towards high-tech reliance on China. So China supplies critical infrastructure while El Salvador exports lower value goods. And after cutting ties with Taiwan, exports to China briefly spiked but then plummeted while imports kept rising. This growing trade imbalance raises questions about the long-term dependency and China's expanding influence in El Salvador's economy. Over the past 20 years, El Salvador has become highly dependent on Chinese goods, with a trade deficit growing from 241 million in 2003 to 2.42 billion in 2023. And you can see on the graph to the side how imports of China to El Salvador have consistently risen, while exports have largely remained stagnated. So here's just a couple of some Chinese infrastructure projects in El Salvador. For example, a 54 million project for the Yanjiang Group to build an ultra-modern library in San Salvador, a $500 million sports stadium built by the Chinese state-owned Costco Ocean Shipping Company, an $85 million project to improve water treatment facilities by the Hebei Construction Group and CUCD, and 200 million has been invested to support Bukele's Surf City project to boost tourism. It's important to note that these high-profile infrastructure projects focus on public infrastructure, tourism, and global connectivity to strengthen China's economic foothold in El Salvador.
Chinese investment is eroding American-oriented support on the international stage. Our data looks at El Salvador and Guatemala UN voting records from the period of 2016 to 2023. Within this period, it's important to note some key factors. Both countries before 2018 recognized Taiwan and had neutral relations with China. 2018 is an important year, as it is the year in which El Salvador switched its recognition from Taiwan to China. Later that year, and 2019, El Salvador signed memorandums of understanding with the PRC. At the same time, it saw swift U.S. criticism for this recognition, although it was less critical for Honduras when it had done so prior. So as we see in our graph, El Salvador had a noticeable increase in the gap for the voting records. This can be explained by a few factors: swift condemnation by the U.S., and an equal cooperation and investment from the U.S. as compared to China. We can determine that El Salvador is starting to leave the U.S. sphere of influence and go further along with China. Furthermore, our analysis also tracked El Salvador's voting record in the UN as compared to China's. Tracking Salvadorian votes in the UN from the General Assembly to its position in the ECOSOC, or the United Nations Economic and Social Council, we tracked contentious votes to see how El Salvador would vote. In resolutions proposed by the Group of 77, which is a conglomerate of countries in the Global South, plus China, El Salvador voted consistently with the bloc opposing the United States. Much of these votes had to do with topics such as Ukraine, Cuba, and Israel-Palestine. It is an exercise of El Salvador's international autonomy from the United States. It does not have to fall in line, unlike countries such as Colombia, Israel, and Canada, which have consistently voted with the United States. As we can see, El Salvador is starting to realign its voting with that of China, and its benefits and investments are doing much so as reorienting El Salvador's politics on the global stage. Lastly, we observe the mechanism of debt incurrence. Debt becomes another tool of influence for countries entering China's orbit. But what does this power look like? For countries in Africa and Asia, there are real risks with being indebted to the giant. Burkina Faso's natural resources are not fully within its control. Its debt to China is being paid for by the Chinese companies that sell its natural resources. In a sense, it is a loss of sovereignty. Laos is a different form of this loss of sovereignty. Its debt to China has caused inflation to grow abruptly, and its compensation can be land, resources, or infrastructure. In El Salvador's case, its debt steadily grew since the entrance of Bukele in 2019. However, El Salvador was able to pay a large amount of this debt in 2023. Yet the implications of debt traps are very real. China offered to buy up El Salvador's external debt, but the offer was later rescinded. It still represents a credible commitment on China's part to back up its new partners. However, these are merely Faustian bargains. To sell a debt means the country will be forced to heed the new creditor, which would be China. And China's interests are its own. China is an alternative to the IMF and the United States. Its funds may be unconditional until it's time for compensation. And when it comes to this, it may be untenable for the countries that receive this aid, and it can come in the form of land, resources, or infrastructure built to foot the bill. Our analysis covers Chinese investments in the form of the BRI, or Belt and Road Initiative, and how it advances geopolitical goals in Latin America. Our case study of El Salvador allows greater scrutiny of how this policy works. Chinese investments in El Salvador undermine Taiwanese recognition as compensation, presented an alternative to Western finance and development goals, and eroded American favor in international forums. Chinese efforts are on increasing debt for El Salvador, voting realignment in the UN, and an increased trade deficit. For El Salvador, the country must grapple with being in the sphere of influence of China, while being in the U.S.'s backyard. That is the success of China's program. It is able to exert influence in the Americas. For Latin America, it will continue to be a battleground for influence between the United States and China. China is the alternative to the United States. And so much investment promises development, but the cost is always hidden.